Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of The Congregation. I'm your host Ryan MacLeod of the Clan MacLeod, and I just want to start from the top just to continue to let you know what this show is and what this show is about. I'm aware that some of the episodes I say some things and not others, so this is going to be the full head on here. Feel free to skip ahead if you've heard all this before. Basically, The Congregation is a letter writing show centred in and around video games, video game adjacent topics. So, for example, if you want to write in and talk about a game that you really like that no one else has ever played or even ever heard of, feel free to write in about the show and we'll have a bit of civil discourse about it. Optionally, if you want to write in to talk about your favourite video game based TV show or video game adaptation to movies, anything in and around video games, even when I talk about the industry itself, which is kind of a bit of a turbulent thing right now, please feel free to write into the show. We'll read your letter out in full on air and I'll give my 10 cents on whatever you want to raise there. Now, this show eventually will be live streamed. Obviously in these early days we don't have much in the way of views or subscribers, so it's not practical to do that right now, but these are still filmed in the same way that they will be when they go to live stream. So with kind of that little bit out of the way there, today the show is kind of centred around the topics of peripherals and additional experiences to video games. Now, I'm going to start with this first article from a website called Fiction Talk, which will set the scene for this episode. Now, just to kind of tack on to the end of what I was just saying there, actually. Being a letter writing show with not much in the way of subscribers or viewers at the moment, there are no letters to write in. So again, we are filming this in the same way we would do a live show, but in lieu of letters, I'm going to do it with articles from the internet around what I want to talk about for the first little while. But obviously, in future episodes, the narrative and the subject is completely on you folks. So this article is called "Were Companion Apps Ever Actually a Good Idea?" from Fiction Talk, written by Dan Waterman. Game development goes through some very strange trends, especially with hardware. Motion controls were the future, then VR, now cloud gaming. It seems like one idea dominates the industry's innovation for years at a time. A while ago, that was the second screen experience. The idea was to have a main screen where you can play the game, and a second screen to provide supplementary information while you play. This usually came in the form of a companion app that players could download on their phone. The problem was, none of these were actually enhanced the experience in any meaningful way. Most of the time, these apps simply provided a way to view the world map on your phone rather than your TV, like Assassin's Creed. The problem is that looking at a map on your phone won't pause the game, unlike the in-game map. Another feature was the ability to change equipment and loadouts like the Fallout 4 Pip-Boy app. While it was cool to use, especially if you put your phone in the Pip-Boy that came with the Collector's Edition, good luck trying to use a stim pack while being shot by super mutants. Although some of the better apps actually provided a mobile game to play. The Battlefront app gave you a cool card game to play, which also helped unlock items in the main game. One of the coolest ones was the CTOS app for Watch Dogs, where you could play as a police trying to stop another player as they race through the streets in the main game. But no matter how fun the little minigame was, it was never actually impacted the experience of the main game, because they knew that not everybody would download the app. The main game needed to stand on its own, so none of these games were designed to integrate with an app in any significant way. It seems like the apps were simply added in the end to follow the trend, because they were cheap to develop. It's strange to see what gimmicks the industry grasps onto, especially when there's no real innovation to be made. I think the companion apps were pretty bland back in the day, and I'm not sad to see them gone. So that was Dan writing over in Fiction Talk there. Now, personally, I was sad to see them go, and not because I used them, but because there was potential there. Now, Dan goes on to speak in that article, and there'll be a link to the full article below, how it really came around in the success of the Nintendo era the Nintendo DS having its dual screen option, and later on the Wii U as well. So yeah, the whole thing was very much a trend chasing exercise. Now with that said, everyone has phones, or if you don't, to quote that guy from Blizzard, don't you have phones? But I'll lament the passing fad of them, because I think there was untapped potential there. Now, kind of what Dan was getting on about in that article there, I think the utilisation, if it was to ever come back, or if it was to ever succeed back in the day, it needed to provide an experience where, although you weren't playing the full game, it did contribute in some significant way. So the CTOS app that Dan wrote about just there was a perfect example. It was essentially a multiplayer portion for the game. So I could be playing Watch Dogs there, and my fiance could be sitting on her phone sending the police to attack me. That in itself was an impactful way, not that it impacted the story or the progression of the game, but it was an actual interaction with the game itself. Now, like Dan said, most of them were basically just second screen maps, basically, that replaced the need of a pause menu. But if you want to check something like that in a game, you need to pause the game. Your attention is diverted elsewhere. Now, another example I can think of that was quite controversial was the Destiny app. Now, when Destiny initially launched back in 2014, I want to say, when the first game launched anyway, near the earlier days of the last generation, a lot of the storyline was hidden in that app. The game didn't explain a lot of the narrative to you. If you wanted to know about the different factions in the game, you had to go into the app and read the codex, I believe it was called. Now that was detrimental. That actually took away from the game itself. It's like the polar opposite of what a companion app should or could have been. Now, I don't think we'll see a resurgence of companion apps necessarily. I think in the age of cloud gaming, I think that's going to fill a void where, that the mobile phone market needs to fill, basically. But if I did want to see it come back, I would want to see something like this. In Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, I think it was, there was a game mode in there where you could you basically formed your own little enclave. I'm not sure what the in-game term for it was, where you would send out assassins on missions, and they would be gone in real time. So if you sent them on the mission, there would be a timer on it, say 3 hours, and then 3 hours time you check the game, and it was either be a success or a fail. If they succeeded, they brought back resources to build your brotherhood out, and if it failed, it failed. Sometimes they would die, I think. But would it be cool if there was an app which let you do that outside of the game without having to launch your actual console to dispatch your assassins while you're at work or while you're out to dinner? Not that it's socially acceptable to be on your phone during dinner, but those kind of things where it lets you control something from the game but outside the game, I think is where companion apps should have thrived more. Not just that, but if you've got any games that require farming, here's a perfect example, although it wasn't necessarily a companion app, is when Pokemon had a little peripheral. It was like a Pokeball. You transferred your Pokemon into your little Pokeball, and as you walked around at the pedometer, and the more steps you took, it earned experience as you walked around. So again, that's that idea of bringing something out of the game and actually having an impact, because when you put the Pokemon back into your game, it leveled up. Here's another example I can think of. Before Fable 2 came out on the Xbox 360, about a month or two before it came out, they released something called pub games, where you could play some of the in-game mini-games prior to launch. Now, this came out on the Xbox, it wasn't an app. But if that was released as an app beforehand, where you could basically earn in-game coin through in-game gambling, I guess, not that it's got anything to do with microtransactions or anything like that, again, that would be a really cool way to boost your in-game income without having to go around, killing monsters or whatever it was you actually done in Fable 2. I really want to replay that game, actually. I've said that out loud. But I really think a companion app would be a good idea to revisit in the future. Again, I don't know. I doubt Microsoft has any fervour to go ahead and do that, because again, if they want you to play mobile, they want you playing full games. But something that adds to the experience rather than substitutes, like in the case of world maps, or in Destiny's case, completely takes away from the experience. Stay hydrated. This next one comes from Kyle Orland over at Ars Technicana, who's written an article called RIP Kinect. Discontinued USB adapter is the last nail in the coffin for influential tech. Kyle writes, Microsoft is no longer producing the USB Kinect adapter needed to hook the latest version of the depth sensing camera's proprietary connection to an Xbox One S, One X or PC. The adapter, which was briefly offered for free to Xbox One S purchasers through last March, was subsequently sold for $40 to users who still wanted to use the camera and voice activated microphone array on more modern hardware. But Microsoft has now confirmed to Polygon that the adapter is no longer being produced, so Microsoft can, quote, focus attention on launching new, higher fan-requested gaming accessories across Xbox One and Windows 10. While the adapter can still be purchased second-hand, often at a significant premium, and the Kinect can still be used with original Xbox One hardware, or in Microsoft Redmond's campus store, the move is clear. Final nail in the coffin regarding any continued Kinect support on Microsoft's part. It has long been a slow death for Microsoft's Kinect initiative, which was clearly in trouble once the unit was unbundled from the standard Xbox One package in 2014, leading almost immediately to heavily improved sales for the Kinect 3 console. By the time Microsoft announced it was halting Kinect production a few months ago, both user demand and developer support for the unit had been rapidly congealing for years. But it's worth remembering how revolutionary the original Kinect felt following its explosive launch in late 2010. The prospect of playing games without a controller led the $150 peripheral to become the world's fastest selling consumer electronics device out of the gate, with 10 million units sold in under 6 months. One could see the potential signs of impending fad in that early success, though as a relatively low initial attach rate for Kinect software showed users weren't engaging much past the unbundled Kinect Adventures and perhaps Harmonix's Dance Central. Our initial assessment of the tech noted problems with lag, resolution, lack of buttons, and a need of lots of space that would prove key to limiting Kinect's long-term appeal. By 2012, however, Microsoft is still pushing Kinect's power titles hard on the E3 stage. It was also pushing the technology on a somewhat reluctant Windows audience, which came to be dominated by hackers more than any commercial development. By the time a new and improved version of Kinect was being tied to the Xbox One in 2013, Microsoft should perhaps have sensed that technology moment had passed. But the company instead leaned in heavily on improved hardware, confident that the ubiquitous voice control from anywhere in the room would justify the $100 in additional hardware price over competition. While that was no doubt true for some, the vast majority of consumers had clearly gotten over the Kinect's gee whiz factor years ago. Not that Microsoft seemed entirely aware of the shift in consumer sentiment. The Kinect is really something that we feel once you take out, lots of people will go, gosh, I really liked that, I got used to it and now I'm going to miss it. Xbox Group Program Manager David Dennis told Ars Technicana just moments before the hardware was unbundled. I think the more consumers get exposed to it, the more they'll use it. They'll realise what a great, amazing experience it was. Kinect technology lives on, in a miniaturised form, in Microsoft mixed reality headsets, which use outward-facing depth-sensing cameras to detect head movement and controller positioning. Similarly, miniaturised technology powers the Face ID system in Apple's iPhone X, as well as Google's recently discontinued Project Tango. While the Kinect may not have ended up as a permanent revolution in the controller-free user interface, its impact on the consumer electronics industry is still being felt today. As Microsoft heads into its first full Kinect-free year this decade, it seems like as good of an excuse as to drag out the old Xbox 360 and indulge in one more game of Dance Central to remember it by. So that was written by Kyle over at Ars Technicana in 2018 there. Now, here's a bit of a personal story here. When Kinect launched, I worked for a retailer here in the UK called Game Station. Still, best job I ever had. It was good, you know, I was in my teens. It was good. My job was literally to talk about games. I mean, yeah, you'd serve the tills and you'd take the trade-ins and stuff like that. But actually talking to the customers about games was hands down brilliant. And good staff there as well. I miss them all. Part of my job, they announced the Kinect in March of that year, if I remember, and it was launched in November. And part of my job was to talk up the Kinect and secure those pre-orders. We'll take in deposits, I think. How do I put this? I bought into my own hype. I'm that good a salesman that I convinced myself. Because when it was first announced, you know, you look at it, and I was just like, iToy. You remember the iToy? If you don't remember the iToy, it was the PlayStation 2 equivalent. It was a webcam, basically. You sat on top of your TV, playing mini games where you're popping bubbles with your hands and washing windows. But yeah, we were not that far removed out from iToy that I still thought, right, it's just an iToy basically. But, you know, job being what it was, you brought up the talking points. Oh, you'll be able to control it with your voice. Xbox, play music, you know, things like that. Stuff that is everyday today, you know. You've got Siri, you've got Google Assistant, you've got Alexa. But, you know, back in the day, this was a brand new thing. You know, we're talking a decade ago at this point. So I bought into it somehow. And, you know, day one, bought it, took it home, got out of the box, put it on top of the TV, and I delved right into Kinect Adventures, which I think was bundled in. And for a few brief moments, I was loving it. The Kinect Adventures, you know, you're going down Rubber Dinghy Rapids, bro. Sorry, that's an in-joke there. You're going down River Rapids, and sorry if I'm coming out the microphone range here, but this is what you're doing to control it, and sure enough, it's reflected on the screen. And it was pretty one-to-one. I wasn't, you know, the article there mentioned something about lag or input delays. I didn't personally notice any of that, but I was loving it. Starting a bit hot and sweaty under the collar. I was a bit larger than I am today. I'm still large, not that you can see. But then I popped in Dance Central. We've talked about harmonics on this channel before. I love harmonics as a developer. I love anything to do with music. Music's my other interest outside of video games. Dance Central was amazing. Now, I was you know, I'm pretty long-haired at the moment, but I was you know, I was a real metalhead back in those days. I was like, everything else is rubbish. So I played on Dance Central. I didn't know any of the songs. Next thing you know, I'm giving it Soldier Boy and all that. And again, it was one-to-one. Harmonics are, you know, they're rhythm based, so they had to make sure that any input delay or input lag was compensated for. And it was amazing just how much I was able to replicate my movements, because I had like a silhouette that followed your movements so that you could see on screen, you know, you're reaching for the right things and stuff like that. Now, I don't remember buying anything for Kinect after that. In fact, I traded it in pretty quickly. And truth be told, I accidentally broke the Kinect. The little stand that the camera came on, it snapped off. I didn't even realise it. I went to trade it in at my work. But then we realised what happened. I was like, oh, damn, I can't trade this in here, can I? So what I did was I glued it in and I took it to another city. I traded it in there and they didn't notice. But I think there was only so much potential it could go on. I mean, I think the fact that that PlayStation abandoned the iToy kind of spoke to where that market was coming from. Yeah, the voice control and all that was cool, but as we've seen years later, it's a common thing in mobile phones and home assistants, and there's no reason why you couldn't just build that into a controller. Not that they did, but if you've got a headset on, I think you can still do that. I think where it really kind of lost me though was the promise of something called Milo and Me, from Peter Molyneux at Lionhead Studios. Peter Molyneux had, or has, I'm not sure what he's up to these days, always had this thing about selling you on an experience that wasn't quite what always panned out towards the end. So Milo and Me was meant to be an interactive best friend simulator, I guess you can call it. As a little boy, you can go up and be like, "Hi Milo," and he'd be like, "Hi Ryan," and you're like, "Oh wow, that's my name. What would you like to do today, Milo?" "I want to go fishing." "Okay, Milo." And it was meant to be this artificial intelligence that could really interact with you, and it could sense your emotions. So if you were like, Milo would be like, "Why sad, Ryan?" This game never released. It never came to light. It was another Peter Molyneux overpromise. Sorry, Peter. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right there. like he's watching. No one's watching at this point. Still early days. If you're watching, thank you. Stay hydrated. Anyway, rest in peace, Kinect. This next one comes from, and I'm sorry for the pronunciation here, Sakina Mayu. This comes from her blog, entitled "What Square Enix Did Wrong in Their Multimedia Approach for Final Fantasy XV." Let's just address the elephant in the room here. Final Fantasy XV's storyline is a hot mess. Even Tabata admitted in his interview that the storyline in Final Fantasy XV is messy. Some people will say there's nothing wrong with the story, but for the rest of us, myself included, there are tons of things that are left unexplained in the game, making most of us feel unsatisfied with how the story has been laid out in the game. The only way to fill in the plot loopholes is to watch Kingsglaive, Brotherhood, and read Final Fantasy XV Prologue Parting Ways, and yes, buying and playing the DLC. If you can only buy just one DLC, then buy Episode Ignis. The reason for that isn't because I'm an Ignis fangirl, it's because the DLC does fill in some of the plot loopholes in the game. If you can read Japanese, buying a book like Final Fantasy XV Official Works will help as well. The book offers an explanation for the alternate ending in Episode Ignis, so if you feel like you need clarification of arguing back and forth with someone on Reddit, then get that book. That seems like a lot to do just to get a better understanding of the story, right? I can't really say for sure why they decided to have a multimedia approach for Final Fantasy XV, but the reason could be because of the open world concept. I'm pretty sure that they wanted both the open world gameplay and an engaging storyline to be included in the game, but with only a limited number of time to work on the game, then something has to give away. You can guess with which one they had to sacrifice. As a result, now we have a game with the open world gameplay and a bare minimum storyline. I'm sure that they realised what they did would cause a major problem in storytelling as a result of the decision. So, they compensate that by using other forms of media to fill in the plot loopholes, release update patches at a later date, and additional stories in the form of DLC. As expected, they did update the game at a later date, with a few extra scenes and gameplay. They also released Episode Gladio, Episode Prompto, and Episode Ignis DLC to fill in the blank some parts of the story. Even with the latest updates and also the DLC, we still need to depend on other forms of media to fill in the missing part of the story. Whether you like it or not, Square Enix wants us to engage with Final Fantasy XV in a different format if we want to get the whole picture. Even if that's their intention, they're still doing it the wrong way. Here's why I think their multimedia approach for Final Fantasy XV is just a plain disaster. People's first contact with the series plays a major role when it comes to finding a new audience. That's the reason why many manga and light novel publishers are pushing hard to get manga and light novels adapted into anime. The reason for that is simple. Some people's first contact with a franchise is through anime. What's even better, their discovery of the series tends to translate into manga and light novel sales after the anime ended. It's because of this reason that it gets many game developers to push for anime adaptation of their game as well. The video game fanbase is already big on its own thanks to the game localization in multiple languages. But for game developers, it doesn't hurt to use the same strategy to attract many people to buy the game. After all, some anime fans are also video game fans as well. Anime adaptation does help to convert exposure to sales. In other words, game developers are using a different form of media to attract people to a different form of media. We see this all the time in Hollywood, where book sales increase right after a movie adaptation comes out. But for Square Enix, they don't use the multimedia approach just to attract a new audience. They're also using the multimedia approach to get people invested in the storyline. Does their approach work? Well, the release of Kingsglaive, Brotherhood and Final Fantasy XV Prologue Parting Ways does help to get people interested in the game, and it's possible that it also helps with attracting a new audience to the game. But those things fall flat on this simply because most people don't want to invest their time in consuming different media. They expect the game to have a complete storyline without having to consume other forms of media just to understand the storyline. Don't get me wrong, I don't mind with the multimedia approach, but the multimedia approach should only be used as a way to attract a new audience. It's never meant to be used as filler to a broken storyline. Doing that will only create even more disconnections within the story of the game. Instead of having the story scattered everywhere, they should have everything covered in the main game. From there, they can choose to expand the story in a different medium. Please don't do this again. I hope that Square Enix already learns the lesson by now that they should never attempt to have the story scattered in different media. To be honest, I don't mind about the open world concept and a switch to action-based command from the time-based command. All I ever want is a complete game. Feeling satisfied, I already tie all the loose ends. It's sad that Final Fantasy XV doesn't give me that feeling at all. I have to depend on other sources, in the wiki or page, just to understand the storyline. Some part of me feels like Square Enix should just let this game die and move on with something else. But part of me feels like they should be cleaning up the mess before they do anything else. I'm glad they were willing to go on with what most fans want, which is to patch the story. Now I can only hope the same thing won't happen again for Final Fantasy XVI. So some really good valid points there. Now I can't comment on this notion about people having their first interactions with anime. I'm personally, anime is not something I dabble in too often. I really like Death Note. In fact, I love Death Note. I've got on Blu-ray over there actually, which I only bought a few weeks ago. So I think I'll give that a rewatch at some point. But back on topic, I can't comment on that side of things. But when it came to the multimedia approach, I don't think that necessarily it was intended to be filler storyline. I think they wanted it to be seen as in addition to or ancillary. But I think because the main game itself was so underdeveloped, it became almost required watching. Now, I loved the build up to Final Fantasy XV. I loved it. I was working at a cinema at the time, and the cinema ran a screening event. Now, it wasn't for Kingsglaive or anything like that. It was just showing loads of little things like the making of and things like that. And we gave people a goodie bag on the way out, like posters and stuff like that. In a cinema, I'd never seen anything like that. I was working at the time. I never actually went to the event myself. But the multimedia approach to 15 was brilliant. I really liked watching Kingsglaive and Brotherhood on the run-up to release. Now, I 100% agree with our writer here that it shouldn't, all this expanded media and stuff like that should never be required watching to understanding a show. A video game. I guess a good example would be the expanded Star Wars universe or media, if you will. And you could take this example either pre or post Disney when they erased the expanded universe timeline. But you could watch episodes 1 through 3 of Star Wars, the prequel trilogy. And you don't have to have watched Clone Wars to understand it. But if you watch Clone Wars, you have such a better understanding of that period of the Star Wars timeline. And even coming into more current day things, if you've watched Rebels, you're all primed up to watch these shows that are coming out in the future or have already came out, like The Mandalorian, Ahsoka. A lot of these seeds of characters you're seeing in that show, if you've never watched Clone Wars or Rebels, you're not lost. They're just other characters that have appeared, but you've got a deeper understanding if you've watched those anime shows beforehand. And that's the approach that I think Final Fantasy tried to do, but probably just outright failed to do. I would love for other games to take this approach in the future here. My only ask would be anything you release should be accessible on the video game console. So, Kingsglaive, you could rent that. Brotherhood, you can stream it through the YouTube app. I never heard of this, what was it called? Prologue Parting Ways. I didn't even know that was a thing until I read this article. No wonder I was still lost in the storyline. And even to this day, I don't remember the storyline of Final Fantasy 15 that much. It was only a few years ago at this point. I don't remember much about it. I remember playing the game very well. The gameplay itself was pretty good. Obviously, the development of Final Fantasy 15 was rather tumultuous, I think is the word. It was originally Final Fantasy 13 verses, and I went through several iterations. I think at a certain point they just had to put the game out. That's why it came out half-baked, why they haven't... they're not having to. I think they were going to release a DLC anyway at some point. But, they went back and patched a significant portion of the end game based on fan backlash, kind of similar to the Mass Effect 3 scenario of that game's ending. But I'm getting a bit off topic. What I'm saying is, I would love. So let's pick a game. Beyond Good and Evil 2, if that ever comes out. If they wanted to release a film and a YouTube show that serves as either prologue or happens at the same time as that game, I'm for it. I'll consume all that. But I'm not going to go, buy a book or go visit a certain website to get additional information. If it's all accessible on your Xbox or your PlayStation, then, it's not too much of an ask to go and consume additional content, not mandatory content. Our last article today comes from Alex Donaldson. Alex Donaldson over at VG24 writes an article called "Can't we get Lightgun games back in the next generation, please?" It's that time of the video game console cycle where we look forward to the next generation. The PS5 and the Xbox Series X are coming, and they've got names, and that means we can all sit around and dream of what we'd like to see from the generational shift. It'd be nice to see the machines focus less on hitting another resolution bump to 8K, and instead them doubling down on performance, for instance. When it comes to game franchises, I think Microsoft has a real golden opportunity to dig deep and bring back or reboot some old franchises. Fable, Perfect Dark, Banjo-Kazooie. But you know what I really want from the next generation, unlikely as it may be? I want Lightgun games to come back. The PS4 and the Xbox One console generation was the first since the 90s to not see the home release of a Time Crisis title. The PS1 and PS2 had multiple releases such, while the PS3 was blessed with a not so hot Time Crisis 4, which was actually a solid value for money bundling of the 3 different Namco arcade shooters. The series did get a fifth entry in 2015, but has remained arcade only, and with good reason. Lightgun games are difficult to do in modern hardware. It's nothing to do with the consoles, but rather in all modern flat screens. Their specification and refresh rate isn't compatible with traditional Lightgun tech, so the classics from the earlier generations don't work on new screens. While modern games require you to drape stupid ass TV sensors all over your TV, it's messy and it sucks. The Wii meant that Lightgun shooters had a brief renaissance on that platform, but for real accuracy you needed multiple sensors. Nobody wants to precariously tether 3 or 4 sensors around every edge of their $2,000 OLED TV and then still get worse accuracy than a CRT display from the 90s. That was Time Crisis 4's problem. Packing in loads of sensors gives up the cost of any drives up the cost of any Lightgun bundle, while the alternate is to market exclusively to the install bases of things like PSVR, a far cry from being able to bundle in a gun at a slight price premium, as in the 90s. VR shooters, while cool, also take away that social two-player aspect of the genre. A two-player point-blank showdown wouldn't be the same in VR. All of these factors combine to mean that it's no surprise that companies like Sega and Namco have elected to stop releasing arcade shooters on console as they continue to make new ones. Arcade exclusive spin-offs of films of popular games are becoming even more popular. They often deserve a home release. I think the time has come for a renaissance. People clearly want to play Lightgun games. This is why things like House of the Dead Scarlet Dawn and Time Crisis 5 exist, despite not getting console releases. In the time since arcade shooter home ports died off, some American companies have also gotten in the action with AAA shooters too. Raw Thrills, the company behind those big buck hunter games you get in dive bars, has spent the last few years releasing high-end shooters based on licenses like Aliens, Halo, and Jurassic Park. On top of that, we're now in an age of constant re-releases and remasters, and there are a lot of 30-somethings with disposable income and enormous amounts of nostalgia for things like Virtua Cop and Point Blank. You only have to go into one of the arcade bar hybrids popping up everywhere to see that shooters always have the longest queue. But what about technical problems? Well, a solution might have arrived thanks to, of course, the enterprise and emulation community. Sinden Technology is a company that has come up with the appropriate named Sinden Lightgun. That's that back there, by the way. A new type of gun that works on modern displays. The way it works is deceptively simple. There's a camera inside the gun that looks at the screen, and with a small border that is drawn around the game display on screen, the camera can see the border, and from that can use some clever but simple software to calculate exactly where within those borders the gun is shooting. Or pointing. Even if you're standing off at a weird angle and with little calibration, you can use a little game resolution for the border, but the results are profound. Just take a look at a demo inside the action. Now, obviously this article will be linked in the description below. Go have a look at that. Go have a look at that. It's so accurate that it might actually outstrip the classic light guns of the 90s. The gun launched on Kickstarter last year, asking for $32,000, and ended up bringing in over $300,000. Oh, sorry. It also caught the eye of some bigger companies like high-end retro console manufacturer Polymega, which is licensing the technology for a light gun of its own. As the project reaches the phase where production samples exist and backers holding the final product in their hands is in sight, what started as something designed for PC light gun games and emulation now has a far wider potential reach. Beyond PC, Sinden Tech is already compatible with a variety of original hardware, like PS2, and its creator says support for other hardware, including newer machines, is relatively straightforward matter. With the arrival of this HD TV friendly light gun technology in a new generation, it honestly feels like it's time for the classic genre to get back in the living room. Companies like Sega and Namco should be eyeing up the Time Crisis 25th anniversary, or a House of the Dead trilogy re-release. They should be picking up a phone and giving Sinden a call to make it happen. This may all be a mad dream, of course. Game publishers have bigger fish to fry, and the great Guitar Hero driven plastic accessory boom and bust out of the Xbox 360, PS3 and Wii era undoubtedly contributed as much to the publisher trepidation around shipping little plastic guns as it did to landfill. But let me dream. Let next generation be return of the classic arcade shooter at home. You know what? I vibe with this. Very much so. Light gun. Whenever I walk into an arcade, and there's not many arcades in Well, Scotland probably. When I walk in the arcade, the first thing I do is I go, "Where's House of the Dead?" What? No House of the Dead? What's this about? Oh look, there's Terminator something or other. I'll do that. Lightgun games are awesome because it gives you. It's tactile, you know. It's not like shooting a gun with your controller. I mean, yeah, you're pulling a trigger, but you're not holding the gun out. Now, we're in Scotland, we don't have guns here. So it's the closest when I get to a power fantasy when I'm shooting zombies or when I'm shooting Terminators with a light gun. But as the article laid out, it is a technological issue. Now, Sinden Technologies has worked this out now. From what I can tell, and I may be wrong, Sinden Technologies is a bedroom operation. It's a guy operating out of his house, 3D printing the guns, basically making them by hand. I'm sure I went to look into one, and as a result, because you know it's a labour of love, but it's labour nonetheless. It is a bit more expensive. I'm sure it was something in the vicinity of like £80 over here, so maybe $100 US. I may be wrong. But I, you know, if it wasn't, you know, I'm not necessarily an emulator myself, so even if I wanted to back it, there's nothing I could really pump in it. Now, since the article was written, they did announce a House of the Dead remaster, I believe, and I'll try and look that up while I'm talking here. He says while stopping talking, I am so sorry. But it just goes to show that technology is there. Now, what would it benefit from having this on modern gen systems? Well, the multiplayer component, I mean, yeah, leaderboards are probably a good thing. But imagine if you had a game, you know, most Lightgun games are on rails, so you're going through a specific path. But imagine if you were playing a game where, say it's on a big massive map, 8 players, and there are 8 rail routes on that game. Routes where you can like see the other players and what they're shooting at, and you can try and, you know, pick off their targets one by one, so it can get competitive. Not just that, but there's some really good formulas out there. Now, I only ever played this for about 10 or 15 minutes, but one example would be Resident Evil Survivor. Again, I only played it for 10 minutes. I don't know what it was like, and furthermore, I was playing it with a regular controller using the D-pad, and there's nothing worse than playing like on a game with a D-pad. But it really added in a survival horror aspect to it. Here we go. Here's an article from houseofthedead.fandom. Yeah, here we go. House of the Dead remake. The game was revealed on April 14th, 2021 and is scheduled to release later this year on Nintendo Switch. Sorry for pulling that face. I've got a Switch. I like the Switch. It's just, it's really weird and disheartening to see it be a Switch exclusive. Like the original game, the remake is set in December 1998. Forever Entertainment retained the rights from Sega to develop and publish the remake, with Sega sharing a 50% of the revenue. The remake will stay faithful to the original House of the Dead story while adding modernised graphics, voice acting, and gameplay adjustments. While the Nintendo Switch has been the only confirmed platform, there have been written reports that Stadia, Xbox One, PS4, PS5, Epic Games and Steam will also be platforms. Oh, and it also goes on to say a remake of House of the Dead 2 is also in development. I'm learning stuff live on air. But to touch back on the House of the Dead thing, I really want to play the new one, Scarlet Dawn. If you go and look up footage of that game, the graphics in that are amazing. Now, I'm not going to diss too much on the older games. I think there's an inherent charm in the terrible voice acting of the original games, particularly to Suffer Like You Did. If you've played it, you know. But yeah, I don't necessarily think the House of the Dead remake is going to be good without a Lightgun. So here's hoping to the future of Sinden Technologies. If it is an out of bedroom operation, you know, obviously that's a big undertaking. I hope someone approaches them. I don't think Mad Cats is a thing anymore. Turtle Beach. Imagine Turtle Beach comes on and says, "Hey, Sinden, here's a $20 million check for your technology. I'd take it. Or I'd be like, okay, tell you what, 10 million, and then I get 10% of profits from here on out. Something along those lines. But here's hoping to the resurgence of the light gun tech, because, you know, I feel like we're in an age where anything is possible. Anything can be, I was going to say researched, that's not a word. Anything can be brought back as long as it's utilised correctly. And I think that actually speaks out for everything we've discussed on this episode, actually. Everything we've discussed, all great ideas, all had their pros, all had their cons. It's just utilising that stuff properly in the larger space. But with that said, folks, I think that's the end of our show. So again, if you're watching this in early days, thank you so much for doing so. Obviously in the early days, we're not live, we have very little subscribers, very little views. So if you are watching this, thank you so much, and do feel free to write in. We'll read your letter out in the show. Again, anything to do with video games, anything you want to talk about, we'll do it here on the show. And if you're watching this at a later date and you want to write in, please check whatever our latest video is, just to make sure that the email at the bottom is still correct, or if there's a different way you should do it in these days. And with that, folks, go dig out your old Lightguns and your old CRT TVs and have a little blast if you're feeling nostalgic. And we'll see you on the next episode. Thank you.